start by saying that as I'm standing in front of all of you today, I want to recognize the privilege that I have to be up here sharing my story while students across the country are facing disciplinary and legal action for using their voices. My legal name is Camila Aguilera-Steinert. To most, I am known as Camila Aguilera, but to some, I am Cam. My parents come from very different cultural backgrounds. My mom was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, into a wealthy white family that has lived in the United States for many years, while my father was born in Chile into a middle-class family during one of the most brutal dictatorships of all time. While my parents raised me and my brother in a primarily white neighborhood in Boston, they still very intentionally made the decision to give us names that encompass our culture. The decision to hyphenate our last name was one my parents made knowing that it was likely that at some point we would only use one. Due to this, my mom decided to put her last name, Steinert, second, as it was more important to her that we carried on our Chilean heritage than used her name. And that's what happened. By the 5th grade, I was fed up with writing all 16 letters of my last name, and to this day, only use Aguilera. My mother always taught me to stand up for what I believe in, and she was never afraid to tell us stories from her 20s protesting the war in Iraq and getting arrested. But she was very clear that these days of protesting were not over, just paused until we were old enough to march. And when it was time, in 2017, my parents took us out of school and drove 8 hours to Washington, D.C. for the Women's March. I had never in my life seen that many people in one place. In some ways, I felt extremely small, literally and figuratively, but in other ways, I had never felt so a part of something. This feeling fueled me to stand up for other injustices, and now 7 years later, my mom and I have been to many different protests. I wasn't always afraid to speak up. In fact, before I learned to pick my battles, I might have even done it too much. Along with our last names, my parents wanted our heritage to be reflected in our first as well. This resulted in them choosing Camila, one of the most common girls' names in Latin America. Yet despite 10-year-old Camila's best efforts, she never once found a keychain, license plate, or gas station knick-knack with her name on it. Growing up, I received every possible spelling and pronunciation for my name, yet rarely was it ever the correct one. At a certain point, I actively made the choice to accommodate other people's inability to put in the effort to say those 6 letters correctly. This frustration and time spent teaching others manifested into a hatred of my name. One year, as I went off to sleepaway camp, I decided to avoid this, I would rename myself. Surely, the name Cam would be simple or really white enough for them. Eventually, Cam became me, my alter ego, my camp persona, the version of me that didn't want to have to explain, the version that picked assimilation. Living in Jamaica Plain, the white part, and going to Boston Public Schools my entire childhood, I was surrounded by an actually diverse student body. And because of the lottery system in Boston, my classroom was no more than 50% white, despite being in a primarily white neighborhood. I began to believe that this was the norm, a lot of white people, but also a lot of people of color. And as a mixed kid, I never really felt like I fit in with the other Latino kids or with the other white kids. On one hand, my dad is an immigrant and told me stories of growing up in a war-torn country, while on the other, my mom told me stories of going skiing every weekend. Despite my upbringing being a lot closer to my mom's, my parents wanted to make sure that I understood that no one could take away my Latinidad. Juggling the identity of being the oppressor and the oppressed was extremely complicated for a 10-year-old to understand. I began to grow a hatred for my whiteness, a sense of disgust in it. But when coming to Beaver, for the first time in my life, I leaned into my whiteness. Private school is a culture shock in many ways: the wealth, the privilege, the lack of diversity. And as most 8th graders would at a new school, I spent my first few months trying to do everything in my power to fit in. I idolized straight hair and light eyes, and I spent an entire year waking up every morning 2 hours before school to fry my hair because it helped me feel like I fit in. I tried to make myself more palatable. I didn't want to be too loud or too opinionated or too feisty. Attending a primarily white institution for the past 5 years has taught me a lot: how to straighten my hair, how to be quiet, how to hide. I've learned what it feels like to walk on eggshells. One wrong word and this facade that you built starts to crumble. During my freshman year of high school, most of my teachers called me Camila. And as this had been a lifelong struggle, I decided there was no point in correcting them, because after all, my name didn't really matter. It wasn't until the end of that year that this mentality changed. One of my white teachers pulled me aside at the end of the term to apologize for mispronouncing my name, as he had just learned he was saying it incorrectly. He was genuinely apologetic, and he told me that my name is important and that it is just as important for people to say it correctly. I explained to him that after 14 years, I stopped caring how people said my name, and he responded by telling me that my name represents who I am and that I should never be ashamed of either of those things. Those words stung. I was ashamed and embarrassed, but most of all, I felt guilty. Guilty for diminishing my culture and my ancestors who worked tirelessly so mis primos and I could live the best life possible. In the following months, as Trump lost the 2020 election, I was reminded of the Women's March and thought even if I couldn't vote, that my participation might have, even the tiniest bit, impacted things to change. And watching as President Biden was sworn into office, I was amazed by Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb. Following the January 6th Capitol attack, Amanda Gorman celebrates the United States not as a perfect union, but as a country that has the grit to struggle with its all too real problems. The poise and strength she demonstrated throughout her speech inspired me in so many ways, but the line that struck me the most was, "We've learned that quiet isn't always peace." Growing up as a young brown girl, being silenced was a common occurrence. I've always had a lot of things to say, and I've always said those things loudly, sometimes to my own dismay. My extended family referred to me as motor mouth for over a decade. I was constantly told I was too loud or too talkative, and for the sake of others, I should keep it in. For their peace, I should keep it in, but what about mine? What about the little girl who internalized the idea of her voice being too much for this world? It took me a very long time to understand the importance of voicing my opinion and to come to the conclusion that quiet is not synonymous with peace. As someone who started protesting at a young age, standing up for marginalized communities has always been very important to me. Seeing Amanda Gorman voicing that point on live television inspired that voice inside me to speak up yet again. I always told myself that I would never be one to assimilate, yet unconsciously I've been doing so for as longer than I can remember. It took me years to understand that my reluctance to correct people and teach them the proper way to say my name stemmed from my internalized idea that my name was not important. After this realization, I could acknowledge that the way they say my name isn't reflective of me. It's reflective of their ignorance and lack of effort. Once I understood this, I was able to reclaim my name as something I love and turn it into something I love, something I'm proud to share with the world. As I was sitting down to write this, I was reminded of a quote my mom recently sent me. Quote, "One of the most beautiful sounds that I ever heard is the sound of a beautiful, strong woman's voice once she has discovered her true worth. She sounds empowered, she sounds confident, but most of all, she sounds free." From the book Reflections of a Man. There wasn't really much to say in response to that. It was kind of an odd text, a screenshotted quote from Google, and nothing more. But corniness aside, it reminded me of the lesson I had learned years before. Quiet isn't always peace. Seeing other women fighting for change, whether it's my mom or Amanda Gorman, pushes me to be louder. It pushes me to help other brown girls rediscover the voice they once weren't afraid to use. I am who I am, and nothing is going to change that. While it may have taken my entire life to come to this conclusion, I am proud of my identity, and no matter how I look, where I go to school, or any other factors, this will not change. I love my name and all of its 29 letters, whether or not it fits on every form. I will always be Camila Aguilera-Steinert. Thank you.